Yeah, I know. Chances are you clicked on this video because you saw the title and were wondering how the hell I could possibly dislike this movie. A movie that, as of recording, 99% of critics have said they love, making me, quite literally, the 1%. Surely I'm just being contrarian for clicks, right? Well, I honestly wish that were the case, but unfortunately, the long-awaited 7th entry in the Mission Impossible franchise just really didn't do it for me. And not for a lack of trying. For as many issues as I have with Tom Cruise, I've loved pretty much every entry in this series. I saw Fallout no less than 5 times in the theaters and have even gone to bat for the 2nd and 3rd films, especially the 2nd, one even most diehard fans won't defend. Not only that, but Top Gun Maverick was one of my favorite movies last year. Literally made a video saying why it was a perfect cinematic masterpiece. So when I tell you I was more than ready to fall in love with this film, I hope you can believe it. Unfortunately, I just couldn't. And I tried, guys. I've seen it twice and even managed to like it less on second viewing. I genuinely wish this wasn't the case because I love espionage. I love spy fiction and the globe-trotting spectacle of it all. It's my favorite genre. James Bond is my favorite movie franchise, and Mission Impossible usually gives me my spy fix in between Bond outings. It's great, just not this time. Going in, my expectations were high but simple. The only thing I needed this movie to do was to meet the standards set by the previous entries and deliver a fast-paced thriller with cool stunts and a satisfying payoff. After all, these movies are all about the payoff. They're basically elaborate Rube Goldberg machine, and what good's a Rube Goldberg machine without a satisfying payoff? I had some reservations about the film being a part 1 because the first half of two-parters have a tendency to leave me cold, but given the pedigree of talent at the helm, I wasn't overly worried, but maybe I should have been, because Dead Reckoning Part 1 is basically everything I dislike about Part 1s. It's a story half told, one that feels like it's stalling for time, reiterating interesting ideas over and over again without ever progressing them because they need to be left in play for Part 2. As a result, it feels both bloated and empty at the same time. Fallout was a Swiss watch of action filmmaking, a flawlessly designed mechanism in which every single cog and gear felt handcrafted to serve a specific function. There was elegance in its efficiency. Dead Reckoning feels like a clumsy counterfeit, the kind Haley Atwell's Grace would probably catch a criminal charge for pawning off on some unsuspecting tourists in Monaco. It's not a bad forgery by any means. Even counterfeit Mission Impossible is decent, but after you've had the real thing, you can't help but notice all the little ways it doesn't quite feel the same, and the longer you sit with it, the more it starts to bother you. But enough about counterfeit watches. Let's talk about real, efficient, easy ways to make money with this video's sponsor, Pinecone. This video is sponsored by Pinecone. Pinecone is one of the top product review sites that pays people to give feedback. Living in the city is often a pretty big mission for me in so many different ways, and one of the biggest conveniences that also saves me a lot of time is being able to order some of what I need online. A lot of the products I use work out great, others I try and it doesn't work out. Either way, with Pinecone, I can review the things I use and turn part of my expenses into savings. Pinecone is invite only, so they have exclusive opportunities and a guaranteed payout amount for every task you complete. There are even opportunities to test and review products before they hit the shelves, and my link is your way in. Once you're in, and you get rewards. They pay out at higher rates than other similar companies too, which is a mad bonus if you like earning cash for just giving your honest feedback on stuff. I give feedback on Pinecone while working on FilmSpeak videos, and it's kind of become a great life hack and side hustle. I've even bought some awesome movie posters with the extra cash I get from it. So what are you waiting for? Your mission, choose to accept it, is to click my exclusive link in the description box and start earning cash on Pinecone. And thank you so much to Pinecone for sponsoring this video. I've never been all that keen on two-parters. More often than not, they're just one story haphazardly split in half, resulting in a part 1 that's all setup with no payoff, and a part 2 that's all payoff with no setup. Of course, there are plenty of two-parters that work, but they tend to be the ones that operate more like direct sequels than the second half of a continuous story. Two independent narratives that just so happen to form a bigger story. You know, the way continuations in a franchise used to work. Great examples of this recently have been Dune Part 1. Yes, for those of you who've been following the channel for some amount of time, I used to not like this film, but I've actually come around on that. There's more on that at a later time. Across the Spider-Verse, obviously, is a perfect example of how to do that effectively, and even Avengers Infinity War. All of these films are most certainly Part 1s, setting up story threads that are intended to be resolved in a subsequent film, but they each still tell a complete story of their own, with a clear beginning, middle, and most importantly, end. There's some sort of resolution, whether it be for a character's journey or a primary theme. This is because there's a direct causal relationship between the culmination of these stories and their cliffhangers. Thanos' snap is the result of the Avengers losing their battle against him. Paul joining the Fremen is the culmination of his escape from the Harkonnens' attempt to purge his family. These moments don't come at the expense of resolving the central conflict of the story, but instead as a consequence of that resolution. It's clear that this is what Dead Reckoning Part 1 was going for as well, but unfortunately falls flat for one simple reason. Dead Reckoning is very obviously one story split in half. Writer-director Christopher McQuarrie attempts to make Part 1 feel like a self-contained adventure nested within a larger story by having the film revolve around a MacGuffin hunt for the cruciform key, a plot device that needs to be obtained before the overarching story can progress. But this gambit falls flat on its face because the fetch quest simply isn't substantial enough to support 2 hours and 40-some minutes of runtime. You can only watch people chase a MacGuffin around without ever reaching their goal for so long before you start to feel like the movie is just stalling for time. You know how some director's cuts are just the theatrical cut, but with all the deleted scenes put back in? Well, that's kind of what watching Dead Reckoning Part 1 is like. Sequences frequently run longer than they should, killing the tight pacing these films typically have. This would be all well and good if there was a lot of narrative ground to cover, but there really isn't. Nothing about this story necessitates its extended runtime. You'd think that a 2-hour and 40-minute film comprised of just the first 1.5 acts of a larger story would spend its time fleshing out its plot and characters in greater detail than a shorter runtime could afford, but it doesn't. In fact, in a lot of ways, we get less development here than we would have in a regular one-part adventure, for the simple reason that the film seems to be intentionally treading water so as to not progress the story too quickly. Intriguing ideas and characters are introduced, but they aren't allowed to go anywhere. Instead, the film spends most of its runtime reiterating the same few talking points over and over again, as if keeping them in suspended animation until Part 2. To give you an example of how little actually happens in this film, the entire first half is just Ethan chasing down the key fragment he finds in the opening 10 minutes. This key changes hands a comical number of times, and the team just keeps having to track it down until we finally reach the midpoint, and the second half of the key is introduced, turning the remaining half of the film into a protracted mission to unite both pieces. In any other Mission Impossible movie, this wild goose chase would have only taken up the first half of the second act, but here it's drawn out for the entire film for seemingly no other reason than the story cannot move past this plot point until Part 2. So at the end of the film, when Ethan finally recovers both halves of the key and takes off in search of the sunken Russian submarine, we aren't left feeling like a new adventure is beginning off the back of another, but rather that we wasted almost 3 hours on a fetch quest that should have been a 20-minute segment of a tighter film. The final set piece aboard the Orient Express has all the thrills of a traditional Mission Impossible climax, as if the film is trying to convince you a story is being concluded, but it never reaches a satisfying resolution, a feeling only intensified by the fact that the film has spent most of its runtime ruminating on ideas that have yet to be paid off. The most egregious example of this is the central antagonist, a mysterious artificial intelligence simply known as the Entity. Yep, the villain of the movie is a rogue AI, a fact the marketing has curiously gone out of its way to obfuscate. Well, maybe it's not that curious because, yeah, I get it. AI might be a hot topic right now, but Ethan Hunt versus ChatGPT is a pretty tough sell nevertheless. Conveniently, Dead Reckoning Part 1 doesn't really do much with this idea beyond simply setting it up. The Entity is more or less relegated to the background, an ominous threat looming on the horizon should the wrong party obtain the cruciform key and use it to exert control over it. So no matter how much the film tries to frame the search for the the key as the culmination of a complete story in and of itself, the ever-present threat of the entity serves as a constant reminder that the story we're watching is just one small part of a much bigger story that, after 2 hours and 40 minutes, has barely begun. It also doesn't help that we're given all the information about the key, what it unlocks, the submarine, its whereabouts, what happened with it, all within the opening 10 minutes, so that we have to spend the majority of the runtime watching the characters play catch-up. It's a great opening, don't get me wrong, but it almost feels like it hinders the story because we as the audience essentially have all the information the characters spend the rest of the film learning. But yes, Mission Impossible has finally moved on from anarchists and nukes, deciding to set its sights on the threat of artificial intelligence this time around. I'll be honest, when I realized the villain was going to be an AI, I was pretty skeptical. Not even pretty, incredibly skeptical. And unfortunately, that skepticism was not assuaged by the film. I'm still very mixed on the idea. On one hand, I'd be lying if I said that Dead Reckoning failed to make me buy into the stakes of the story. AI definitely pushes this entry further into the realm of science fiction than any previous adventure, but by some miracle, it still feels tethered to the parameters of the world of Mission Impossible. This is most true during the opening scene, which takes place aboard a Russian submarine, testing a new machine learning software. Playing out like an homage to the opening of The Spy Who Loved Me, the submarine intercepts what it believes to be an enemy craft, only for it to turn out to be a ruse by the AI, designed to goad them into firing a torpedo and then destroys their own sub. This sequence is suitably tense and eerie, setting up the entity as this ethereal, all-knowable force encased in an iron dome at the heart of the vessel that almost resembles a brain. It's a really effective little prologue that quickly convinced me this idea could actually work in spite of my initial hesitation. However, it's not long before things come off the rails. What starts as an ominous presence quickly veers into comic book supervillainy as it gradually becomes apparent that McQuarrie doesn't really understand the subject matter he's writing about. Like, we shouldn't be handling AI as a storytelling device the exact same way we did back in the 80s and 90s, especially if you aren't taking the full plunge into science fiction. The promising opening scene dovetails into a US intelligence briefing where Kittredge is giving a number of officials a briefing on the AI. It quickly becomes evident that McQuarrie doesn't view AI as a neutral tool, but rather as an inherently malignant concept, a self-aware, truth-eating digital parasite. And to be fair, he's right to fear its power to become the ultimate fake news weapon, able to manipulate our perception of reality in an increasingly digital world, just as he's right to be concerned about an international arms race to control that awesome power. All of that is spot on, and more importantly, fertile ground for an incredibly prescient espionage thriller. Where it goes awry for me is that the AI is the literal villain. Like, the main antagonist of the story is the sentient algorithm itself. That would be like making a nuke the villain. This inherently malevolent characterization of the AI is all solidified by the arrival of Gabriel, the entity's so-called dark messiah, who is convinced it can use its godlike computing power to predict the future and should therefore shepherd humanity. I see what McQuarrie was going for. He clearly fears a slavish devotion to the false idol that is artificial intelligence, a world where we surrender ourselves to an algorithm. But aside from being an extremely tired cliche at this point, the entity is just a reskinned Skynet from the Terminator series. This depiction of AI misunderstands the real and immediate threat the technology poses. Christopher Nolan recently spoke about AI, and I think his comments can probably sum up my problems with the way this film goes about depicting AI better than I can. If we endorse the view that AI is all-powerful, we are endorsing the view that it can alleviate people of responsibility for their actions, militarily, socioeconomically, whatever. The biggest danger of AI is that we attribute these godlike characteristics to it, and therefore let ourselves off the hook. AI probably isn't anywhere near becoming sentient, but even if it was, the technology in and of itself isn't the problem. The real problem, the real threat AI poses, is that it's a tool that can and likely will be used by the most powerful among us to exacerbate the cruelty of our current system while absolving themselves of their parts in that cruelty. AI is just a tool just as much as nuclear energy, and its capacity for mass destruction is not predicated on whether or not it becomes sentient, but rather on who we let wield it, or perhaps more aptly, weaponize it. McQuarrie is right to fear mankind surrendering its autonomy to algorithms, but he misses that these algorithms in and of themselves aren't the real problem. It's who they serve. AI isn't some all-knowing genius, but that perception is useful to those who stand to gain from them. The movie flirts with this idea by establishing that world governments are seeking out the cruciform key in an attempt to harness the rogue AI for their own self-serving purposes. Furthermore, the reveal that the AI was in fact created by the US government and released as a deliberate act of sabotage against the Russians gets very close to reckoning with the reality that AI is merely a tool that can be weaponized by bad actors, and this more nuanced understanding is undercut by the rest of the film, in which the AI is a malicious all-knowing being that toys with the IMF team on its own accord like a malevolent god. If AI is Frankenstein's monster, Dead Reckoning Part 1 suggests we needn't pay Dr. Frankenstein any mind on our crusade to destroy the evil monster. As a result, Dead Reckoning winds up becoming one of the most technophobic blockbusters of recent memory. It sort of plays like your boomer uncle's Fox News-induced fever dream about technology taking over people's lives. The film is devoted to this idea to such a comically exaggerated degree that even tech-savvy characters like Benji and Luther are reduced to Luddites smashing their computers because the evil AI has hacked their system. It's played straight like this deeply disturbing moment, but it just feels rather goofy. Goofier still is another supposedly dramatic moment where Ilsa realizes all her communications with a potential buyer were digital and therefore likely the entity. The whole thing feels more like a PSA about how to avoid phishing scams than the tense techno thriller it seems to think it is. I legitimately can't express how hard I laughed at that moment specifically. Like, Ilsa, you idiot, don't open that email, the AI is trying to scam you. It's so absurd. The film's confused handling of AI makes a lot more sense when you realize how it is intended to function as a metaphor for analog filmmaking. It's no secret that Tom Cruise and Christopher McQuarrie have had their passion for analog filmmaking a core part of their public personas. Cruise in particular has positioned himself as a champion of practical filmmaking, so much so that this theme has gradually made its way into the subtext of his films. Last year, Top Gun: Maverick made the case that drone warfare can never replace a skilled pilot in the cockpit, using warfare as a proxy for filmmaking to argue in favor of preserving analog filmmaking methods in the face of the industry's hard pivot towards digital effects over the last several decades. Dead Reckoning Part 1 is an extension of this same thematic preoccupation, this time pitting Cruise against a literal algorithm that believes it knows better than humanity. It's basically the plot of Space Jam 2 under the thin veneer of geopolitics. Aside from not really saying anything on the matter that Maverick didn't already say better last year, the film's inability to decide whether AI is a tool or an inherent evil winds up muddying its overall point. Where Maverick is able to make a concise point about the ways in which top brass use automation to rid themselves of humans who are capable of challenging or ignoring their orders in order to seize even more control while displacing the humans who would otherwise do the work, Dead Reckoning is far less precise in its target. In the end, it just winds up feeling like Cruise and McQuarrie coping with their existential dread about the existence of streaming, ChatGPT, and voice emulators, and constructing a fantasy in which they get to defeat them. Or at least that's where I have to assume Part 2 will take this thread, because once again, I cannot overemphasize that the story is only half complete, and so the overall point the film is trying to make about AI as it relates to filmmaking is still unresolved. Speaking of metaphors the film doesn't seem to have a firm grasp on, one of Dead Reckoning's stranger choices is in how it elects to depict the IMF. Now, the exact nature of the IMF has always been rather nebulous. Sometimes it's a branch of the CIA, sometimes it's its own separate branch of the US government, and sometimes it's more of a non-state aligned international agency. But Dead Reckoning goes a step further than any other entry in clearly defining what the IMF is and how it works, riffing on the famous "should you choose to accept it" line that accompanies every mission briefing to reimagine the organization as a group of ex-cons who were offered the choice to join the agency and serve the common good as independent contractors in place of serving prison time for their crimes. The IMF is now essentially a cross between a prison rehabilitation program and the Suicide Squad. And while this is certainly a strange direction to take the IMF, what's even stranger is the way it kind of inadvertently frames the organization as inherently predatory. Inductees are given a choice between incarceration and indentured servitude for the government, but that's not really a choice at all. And although this is a massive departure from the way the agency has previously been portrayed, it's not necessarily a bad idea. In fact, it's tempting to interpret this predation as a deliberate bit of commentary on the way government agencies leverage poverty and the criminal justice system to funnel recruits into service. However, this sentiment is dashed by the fact that it's not interested in depicting this as coercion at all. The film frames the choice as an unambiguously good thing, a second chance for wayward souls. Furthermore, the IMF itself is depicted as nothing less than a righteous institution, free of the impurity and corruption of other intelligence agencies thanks to its independence from government oversight, a characterization McQuarrie first flirted with back in Rogue Nation when the main conflict revolved around the big bad government oversight committee shutting down the IMF for repeatedly operating beyond their brief. This distrust of outsiders and secretive coercion recruitment tactics all kind of make the IMF feel more like a cult than a spy agency, a parallel compounded by the way the choice is presented as a rite of passage. This ritualistic quality comes to a head with Grace's induction into the IMF. When Ethan, Benji, and Luther all present her with the choice, it feels like a cult preying on a vulnerable young woman, cornering her in a moment of insecurity and presenting her with a coercive binary: either join us or spend the rest of your life either in prison or running from the law or, even worse, dead. When she tries to reason with them by suggesting she'll just help with this one mission and then go about her business, they refuse, insisting she has to either join them for life or accept her fate. Given Tom Cruise's own dubious history as a cult figurehead, I can't for the life of me figure out what on earth possessed them to go down this route. Every time Ethan or one of the other crew members talks about the choice, I can't help but be reminded of Cruise's own odd religiosity, which then just circles back and makes the choice to depict the IMF as this unquestioned force of good even more sinister. It's especially difficult to overlook given the way Ethan is portrayed as the embodiment of everything the IMF represents, an infallible good guy whose morality is never in question and whose actions are always conveniently justified by the narrative, no matter how insane they seem in context. It also doesn't help that the entity is presented as the automated version of Ethan and the IMF, a ghost that goes rogue when the government tries to control it. We question the entity and its intentions. Hell, the film villainizes it simply for existing. Yet Ethan and his cohorts are championed for their rogue behavior because the film insists they're always right and never to be questioned. It just feels off. On top of that, the parallel between Ethan and the entity and the nature of their respective quests to operate independently isn't really explored or even addressed. You'd think, given their similarities, that would come up at some point, similar to how Rogue Nation frames the Syndicate as the anti-IMF, but it never does. It's almost as if the film is either unaware of the parallel or is avoiding it, and I really don't know which one is worse. Maybe the point McQuarrie is trying to make with this parallel between Ethan and the entity is that the US government's interest in controlling the entity is driven by a desire to replace the IMF with a more pliable, automated system, and that this desire is just as misplaced as their desire to control the IMF? I don't know. It's kind of a redux of Top Gun Maverick's automation subtext, but that's me being very generous and doing most of the legwork for the film. If this is in fact the case, it's not much more than an inference. Perhaps part 2 will elaborate, but the fact it's not already clear what they're trying to say here is kind of yet another example of how this film doesn't feel like its own complete story. But on the subject of Ethan going rogue, something I actually appreciate about Dead Reckoning Part 1 is that, for once, the narrative puts Ethan in a position where he has to follow orders. Normally, he's had to bend or break the rules to keep someone he cares about alive, but here, his only play, if he wants to keep Ilsa alive, is to toe the line. Early into the film, Kittredge places a bounty on Ilsa's head to motivate Ethan to recover the cruciform key from her on his behalf. However, Kittredge's rationale for doing this is is questionable. When has extorting Ethan into doing one's bidding ever netted a desirable outcome? Surely he should know he didn't need to do that to get Ethan to go after Ilsa, especially given the events of the first film when he tried doing that exact thing with Ethan's family and... Anyways, I get that this is supposed to represent the sum of Ethan's life choices coming back to haunt him, and Kittredge is the consequence of the past incarnate. He's the specter from Ethan's past leveraging their shared history to get what he wants, reminding Ethan of his oath and how the IMF saved him from prison all those years ago. Kittredge is quite literally cashing in a debt. I get it, I really do, but I feel like this, once again, just muddies the water of what the film is trying to say. The IMF is at once independent and under the CIA's boots. They can't simply order the IMF around and must instead send word whenever they need something done. But at the same time, this is another false choice as proven by Kittredge's manipulation. And again, this feels like it would have been a really fascinating commentary on the illusion of choice within a machine designed to exploit you, but the film simply cannot let Ethan be put in a situation where he isn't in control. So instead of exposing a vulnerability in the way Ethan and the IMF operate, Kittredge is more just a thorn in their side, someone to be outsmarted without the film ever reflecting on the system that enables the Kittredges of the world. And then there's Ilsa Faust. Guys, this is what broke me. I could handle the half-told story and the messy themes, but this film outright destroys the best character this franchise has ever produced. And I'm not just talking about the fact that they kill Ilsa in this, and oh boy, we'll get to that. Ilsa's characterization through the entire film is so far removed from what we've come to understand about her that it's hard to call it anything but character assassination. For starters, there's this strange double standard to Ilsa's behavior when compared to Ethan's. The film goes out of its way to criticize Ilsa's roguish behavior to the point where it actively mischaracterizes her role in both Rogue Nation and Fallout. Kittredge describes their relationship as Ethan getting her out of trouble and Ilsa always finding her way back in. I get this is coming from one of the film's antagonists, so we're supposed to not necessarily agree with him, but Ethan doesn't necessarily protest. He doesn't point out that MI6 repeatedly extorted her as a way to pull her back in, nor does he, or the film for that matter, point out that the IMF has pulled the same shit with Ethan. Ilsa's pattern of getting into trouble isn't a pattern at all, but it's never questioned, and the film just goes on as though this is who she is, a welfare case for Ethan, a damsel in distress. And this characterization continues throughout the rest of the story. Ilsa was introduced in Rogue Nation as a capable, independent person with her own objectives and motivations. She wasn't an accessory to Ethan's story, but rather a fully formed character of her own who just so happened to become engaged with Ethan. But Dead Reckoning strips her of much of her autonomy. She becomes little more than a token of physical embodiment of Ethan's sense of duty and the responsibility he feels towards others. In a way, the seeds for this were planted in Fallout during my least favorite scene in that film when Luther tries to convince Ilsa not to come to Kashmir with the crew because Ethan feels responsible for her and therefore her presence would just be an extra burden on him. Never mind the fact that not going would mean failing her mission to capture Solomon Lane to clear her name with MI6. Once again, this moment isn't framed as a character stepping out of line. No one questions it, not even Ilsa, and it never comes up again. Rather, it simply lands like an attempt to reframe Ilsa as little more than Ethan's responsibility, not all that dissimilar to Ethan's last love interest, Julia, who, wouldn't you know it, comes back in the next act to serve as stakes for Ethan. Luckily, this moment didn't really diminish Ilsa's overall presence in Fallout, and she still afforded her own story. But Dead Reckoning, oh boy, that's another case entirely. The cracks in her characterization are right there from the beginning when we learn that Ilsa has gone and gotten herself disavowed again, effectively undoing her journey over the last two films, but I tried to stick with it. I mean, characters go rogue in basically every one of these films, so maybe this wasn't such a regression after all. Ilsa's unsanctioned hunt for the cruciform key isn't all that different from the things Ethan does all the time. However, like I said, this isn't framed as a mirror of Ethan. The film expects us to see her actions here as reckless, needlessly complicating the situation for Ethan, so much so that she is eventually punished for this transgression with death. By having these two characters, and the entity as a matter of fact, behave in the exact same way, only to punish one while lionizing the other, the film is basically asking us to accept that it's simply Ethan's prerogative to act as a free agent, and anyone else doing so is dangerous to both themselves and others. Ethan, and Ethan alone, has earned the trust to act on his own accord because he alone knows what's right and wrong, an idea these films have repeatedly come back to, and sometimes
Ethan is the only one capable of seeing the only way.
Again, I don't necessarily have a problem with the character of Ethan Hunt having this paternalistic worldview where he alone is responsible for protecting everything. The problem is the film itself seems to believe this too, and is unwilling to challenge this assertion in any meaningful way. Ilsa could have been that contrast, that meaningful challenge to the way Ethan operates, the way she was in Rogue Nation and even Fallout, but she's not. She's a burden, a plot device there to reinforce Ethan's story, which makes her death nearly unforgivable. While I personally don't like this decision on its face, killing off the most interesting character in this series, its future in a lot of people's minds, the idea could have worked had the story actually earned this moment by giving her her own stake in the story, but it doesn't. She exists to serve Ethan's story, both in life and in death. Yes, I understand her death is meant to raise the stakes and make the threat posed by Gabriel and the entity feel more tangible, but it doesn't really matter how you slice it. She was fridged. She dies to give Ethan something to cry about. And no matter how hard they try to convince us Ilsa's death was her own choice, dying to save Grace and the mission, it just falls flat because it wasn't really her choice at all. It was Ethan's failure to save her that caused her death. He couldn't save her. Her death is used to hammer home the idea that the relationships in Ethan's life are fated for destruction, and he's doomed to live and die in the shadows for those he holds close and those he never meets. Which is fine in concept, except this exact conflict was already resolved in the Julia subplot in Fallout. In that film, Ethan is forced to once again grapple with the fact that his life not only makes it impossible for him to have a healthy romantic relationship, but that his mere association to people is dangerous for them. And the film concludes with Julia assuring Ethan that no, he isn't a curse on her life. She loves her life and sleeps soundly knowing he's out there to protect her. So for Dead Reckoning to dredge this plot thread up again, killing Ilsa just to make a point that was addressed, is baffling to me. It's almost like McQuarrie was trying to turn Ethan into James Bond, racked with guilt over the death of a loved one. Except he forgot that Vesper Lynd and Tracy Bond actually have a stake in their stories, and their deaths are tragic precisely because they have agency in their own stories, something Ilsa had up until this film. What's even more baffling is the fact that Ilsa isn't just some civilian Ethan's endangering. She's an agent, just like him. So the idea he's responsible for her safety isn't just a retread of the previous film's relationship conflict, it's incredibly patronizing. Ethan's protectiveness over Julia is a little infantilizing, but it at least makes a little sense. Julia isn't in this world of espionage by choice. It was something Ethan dragged her into, so he feels responsible. But Ilsa? The idea he's responsible for her is so degrading. Doubly so, because Ilsa has to die to make this point about the ones close to Ethan not being safe when the previous film managed to refute this very notion, all while avoiding the sacrificial lamb trope. It's just so fucking disappointing, man. Like, I honestly can't believe Christopher McQuarrie would do this to a character he created. Even if they were to reveal in part 2 that this was a fake out, which I highly doubt given Ferguson's loaded schedule, I don't really think it changes much. It wouldn't change the way the character was portrayed throughout the entire film, and in fact, it would just cheapen her character further, treating her like a prop that can be discarded or introduced whenever the story needs her, like someone out of Fast and Furious. But I truly don't think we have to worry about a resurrection, because she's definitely dead. But I can't help but get this sinking feeling McQuarrie isn't done using her like a prop anyway. I'll tell you what, $50 says the entity makes a digital version of Ilsa to tempt Ethan in part 2 a la Blade Runner 2049, and oh man, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. Ethan's relationship with Ilsa isn't the only strange relationship in this film though, because Ilsa is pretty swiftly replaced by Grace. I guess we can't just have two capable badass women on the team at the same time. Sorry Ilsa, you finally joined the Paula Patton and Maggie Q club of token IMF women gone too soon. And it's a shame that Grace is put in this position as a replacement for Ilsa because I actually really liked her otherwise. The idea of having Ethan encounter someone who reminds him of his younger self is a nice way to open up the character's past a little more. Grace gets to be a mirror to Ethan while also clashing with him. It's definitely a bit off-putting that they seem to be setting her up to become the new Ethan or whatever, seeing that's what a lot of fans figured Ilsa would become once Cruise departed the series, but there's still something compelling to Grace regardless. Seeing Ethan in more of a mentor position, recognizing a stranger's potential and honing it is a fun idea. It kind of feels like a more in-depth version of something they attempted in Mission Impossible 3 with Lindsay Ferris. And Haley Atwell is incredibly charming as this lovable rogue who has escaped poverty by taking what she wants and staying one step ahead of the law. It's great. I love her, and I love that she's finally getting a moment like this in the spotlight. In a way, Dead Reckoning Part 1 can be seen as Grace's origin story. However, despite this, we don't really learn much about her over the course of this journey. Hell, we don't even know for sure that Grace is her real name. And look, I love a mystery as much as the next person, but it feels a little cheap to split a movie into two halves and then not even use that extra time to get to know the new co-lead you're introducing to essentially replace a beloved character. Grace still largely works thanks entirely to Atwell's considerable charisma, but even that is limited by the fact that it's very unclear how we're supposed to view her relationship with Ethan. Tom Cruise and Haley Atwell just don't have chemistry, or rather what chemistry they do have is hard to pin down. And let's be honest, no one's gonna have the chemistry that Rebecca Ferguson and Tom Cruise have. They got it. But in the case of Tom Cruise and Haley Atwell, it's weird because I can't tell if it's meant to be sexual flirtationship or a mentor-mentee relationship. Atwell plays up the brilliant charm, but Tom is very much not flirting. One moment that only confuses this matter further is the nightclub scene in Venice, during which Gabriel has a short conversation with Grace and suggests that she ought to be careful with Ethan because he makes empty promises to protect the women in his life in order to get things from them. But that doesn't really track. Ethan definitely promises to protect the people in his life, particularly the women he encounters, but it's almost always presented as a noble gesture. The idea that Gabriel might know things that challenge this perception is intriguing, but it doesn't really go anywhere. No one ever mentions it again. I guess we can assume it has something to do with the flashback we see where another woman in Ethan's life gets killed. Somehow, McQuarrie manages to fridge two women in one film. But because we have to wait until part 2 for context on this moment, Gabriel's comments are nothing more than a shallow lie, which isn't necessarily a problem. I mean, he's the villain after all, and villains lie about the heroes all the time, but it's also not very interesting. It tells us nothing about either character we don't already know and only serves to tee up a conflict for a different movie. And that's a damn shame because it really could have been interesting. Ethan is always portrayed as perfectly moral and virtuous, so it would be an interesting wrinkle to challenge that in a meaningful way and raise suspicion as to his true motives. Are they really as well-intentioned as we've been led to believe? In a better movie, I think that idea would be explored in more depth. I doubt it would have made me like the decision to kill Ilsa, but a little doubt as to the game Ethan is playing with all the people in his life might have actually given it a little more thematic weight beyond Ethan couldn't protect her and now he's sad. But alas, the movie just kind of does nothing with it, and it comes across like a vague lie told by the bad guy to sow discord. While I don't hate all of this, it just leaves a really bad taste in my mouth going into the final act. I do like the fact that Luther questions Ethan on what's driving him in the wake of Ilsa's death, but again, I wish the movie committed to this idea that Ethan's motives could be anything but noble. The movie wants me to suspect he's been driven by vengeance, but I know he isn't because Ethan Hunt is literally never wrong. He's the cinematic equivalent of saying, my biggest flaw is that I care too much. I'm not saying I need Ethan Hunt to be the super morally ambiguous character. Not at all. But the movie keeps suggesting he might be without committing to the idea, and after a while, I stop believing it's even a possibility. On the flip side, there are just as many opportunities to play his idealism as a weakness as well, something that once again comes into play in the nightclub sequence. When Alana, the White Widow, isn't able to make a clear decision to not give the second half of the key to Gabriel out of fear it could have consequences for her own life, Ethan expresses disappointment in her. You get the sense he's expecting more from her because he knows she has a conscience deep down, and is disappointed that she isn't willing to put the mission over her own self-preservation the way he is. This is another really great setup to challenge Ethan as a character, his naivete in assuming people are as selfless as himself deep down. But again, it doesn't go anywhere. It's more or less chalked up to a moral failing on Alana's part to avoid suggesting Ethan's worldview is overly simplistic. The movie then completely abandons this thread entirely when Paris changes her entire worldview because of the mercy shown to her by Ethan in the alley, which, by the way, that's a great fight scene. It's probably the best action sequence in the entire film. I really loved that sequence. In theory, I like this beat. The idea that someone like Paris, who's devoted herself to the entity, presumably because of the state of the world she's lost her faith in, is shown a sign that some people are still good, and perhaps begins to believe that not all people are bad, not everything is as cold as an algorithm, and perhaps she should open herself up to the possibility. It's solid stuff, but it comes out of nowhere. A shock reveal that literally elicited laughs from my audience because of how jarring and unexpected it was. In the end, Ethan is proven right. The world of Dead Reckoning really is as simple as he believes, and people like Alana, who choose to do things out of self-preservation, are simply failing to make the moral choice. This ethos that Ethan Hunt is an incorruptible, almost messianic hero with the power to literally redeem the people he encounters by his example, all feels a bit too Scientology for my taste. Don't get me wrong, I'm genuinely all for separating the art from the artist, and I almost always do, but it's also a personal issue and it's a case-by-case basis. And so much of Ethan Hunt is Tom Cruise, so much so that it's kinda hard to discern where Cruise ends and Ethan begins, and all of this doesn't make it any easier. Between his unquestioned moral righteousness and the IMF stuff, this might be the most overtly rooted in the ideology of his weirdo cult a Cruise film has ever been. I digress. I know this doesn't really matter for a lot of you, and you really only care about these movies because of the action, because of the stunts. As long as the action is good, that's all that matters. The stunts are pretty much what these films are sold on at this point. And that's fair enough. The action in these films is phenomenal, and Dead Reckoning Part 1 is no exception. There are a number of really fantastic stunts in this film that legitimately look great, but none of it rises to the highs of Fallout or even Mission Impossible 2. There are some really great set pieces ideas in here, but they're not nearly as tight as they need to be. A prime example of this is the Fiat chase through Rome, which is one of the most bizarrely paced action sequences I've seen in a very long time. The stunt driver is genuinely amazing, as is the use of actual city streets, but the sequence itself lacks punch. There's no momentum to anything. It's just a series of beats loosely strung together. The action is constantly interrupted as the pair change vehicles, and the sequence just kind of fizzles out rather than ending on a bang. We don't even get a big car crash when Ethan sends Paris's vehicle hurtling into a lineup of police cars. She just sorta evades them. It's just a bit lackluster. Earlier, I mentioned that the film feels padded, and this is exactly why. More action is not the same as exciting action. Novelty is another huge part of the appeal of the action in these films. At their best, they're boundary pushing. Perfect example example is the Burj Khalifa sequence in Ghost Protocol. Nothing like that has ever been done before, and it blows me away every single time. But the sequence in Dead Reckoning doesn't really have anything new to offer. I've seen chases through Rome plenty of times, including earlier this year in Fast X. The film tries to put Ethan out of his comfort zone by placing him in a tiny, unwieldy yellow Fiat. But even that has been done before in For Your Eyes Only, a sequence this is clearly borrowing from, even if McQuarrie insists otherwise. The big climactic cliff jump has a similar issue. It's an impressive stunt, but it's nothing we haven't seen before. It's just a mashup of GoldenEye and The Spy Who Loved Me pre-title sequences. And while the big shot of Cruise driving off the edge of the cliff is great, the rest of the scene denies us the wide shot that really lets us soak in the scale of what we're watching. The camera is surprisingly tight on Cruise, as if it's more important to remind you he's actually doing it than it is to just let the moment breathe naturally. And what's worse is, similar to the impressive diving sequence in Rogue Nation, McQuarrie cuts away from the stunt mid-action only to play it as a punchline later on. And don't get me wrong, it's a great punchline, genuinely a funny moment, but the impact of the stunt the entire marketing was centered around is dampened because the film cuts away from it. The final set piece on the Orient Express is probably the best action in the film, with some terrific hand-to-hand combat on the roof of the train, followed by a spectacular crash and ascent through falling carriages. Very reminiscent of Uncharted 3. In fact, I'm sure that was a big inspiration for that sequence. However, oddly enough, there's some really notable CGI in these moments that just takes you right out. I'm by no means criticizing the use of CGI in action scenes. Most movies do it, and plenty of films this year that I like do it. But if your whole sales pitch is, this is all done for real, it's a bit jarring when the climax of the film is more or less a big CGI spectacle. There's also a lack of variety. Usually the action in a Mission Impossible film varies. You get chases and stunts and infiltrations and close quarters combat, but there isn't nearly as much of that variety this time around. The movie is basically one long chase, and every action scene is essentially just characters pursuing each other on foot or in vehicles. If I had a nickel for every time Ethan chases Grace in this film, I could probably fund the next Mission Impossible movie. We don't even get a heist scene, a staple of these films, which is especially surprising given how indebted this film is to Brian De Palma's original. In some ways, McQuarrie captures the eerie tone of that film, but in others, it just feels like a lacking imitation. McQuarrie's idea of doing De Palma is just a bunch of haphazardly motivated low Dutch angles. The plot feels just as convoluted as the original, but with none of the De Palma seediness. That original film managed to capture the gross voyeurism of espionage in a way no other spy film ever has, and is part of the reason it's still so good. There's just nothing else out there that feels like it, and that's still true despite Christopher McQuarrie's best attempts. I appreciate what he was trying to do with the homage to De Palma, using canted angles and quick, disorienting edits to evoke a sense of paranoia to convey the film's central preoccupation with the subjectivity of truth and the uncertainty of true autonomy in the face of an intelligence so powerful its predictive powers border on precognition. McQuarrie's camera seeks to put us right in the middle of this struggle. But while I can recognize that intention after the fact, the truth is, this was not readily apparent while watching the film. These decisions make sense on paper, but in execution, they just feel sloppy. The same goes for the decision to shoot on digital rather than film as the previous entries were. Although I can see how this also reflects the idea of automation giving the film this cold, artificial look, my brain really wasn't picking up the intended message while watching the film. All I could think was, boy, this sure looks worse than the last few entries. Which isn't to say digital is inherently inferior to film. I mean, look at the work of Roger Deakins and David Fincher. They've shown us just how good digital films can look when approached correctly. But it almost feels like the choice to shoot on digital was made only to make a thematic point rather than because McQuarrie and cinematographer Fraser Taggart actually had a handle on how to do so effectively. The film looks sterile and flat in a way that cheapens the otherwise high production value. This inelegance is even there in the script. McQuarrie is a phenomenal writer. I know he is. The man wrote The Usual Suspects, but this script is one of his weaker efforts by far. So much of the script is just exposition, some of the most egregious I've seen in a film in a while. Characters just info dump about the plot and wax poetic about the threat of artificial intelligence, the latter of which would be fine if these philosophical musings were allowed to reach some kind of conclusion, but they're not. These ideas aren't developed over the course of the film because, again, this is half of a movie and the answers must wait for part 2. So instead, the characters just repeat the same observations over and over. This AI is everywhere, it's cold and calculating, it's destroying the concept of truth. These aren't profound observations, they're just prompts for much more involved conversations that McQuarrie is likely saving for next time. Don't get me wrong, I think this is a competently made film. What frustrates me is its clear attempts to be more interesting that fall flat. I'll be the first to tell you that I appreciate this series' commitment to practical filmmaking. It's something that I actually applaud filmmakers for doing in an era where it's easy to default to visual effects and green screens and all that stuff. But if that ambition isn't in step with your narrative, I'm just left watching a bunch of stitched together action beats like a stunt reel. It's cool, but you gotta give me more. I think doing it for real has had an impact on how people view these films, for better or worse, and perhaps gives this series a bit more leeway narratively, especially in this outing. Fallout works because of the story's simplicity and the focus on music, action, filmmaking. It's arguably the truest testament of their silent film Buster Keaton approach. That doesn't really work so much here. Doing it for real, executing impressive stunts doesn't make a movie inherently better, just like overusing CGI doesn't make a movie inherently bad. Sure, it can contribute to your overall enjoyment, and we can have preferences, but story is king, man. It comes before all else. The story might work for someone, and that's great. I'm really glad if it does. I get it. There's interesting ideas buried under all the bloat for sure, but I think this is easily the weakest script of the series, and practical death-defying stunts aren't going to make me enjoy it more just because they did it for real. I know, this is a lot. I don't know if I've adequately conveyed just how much I want to like this film, because I really do, guys. Like, it has so many elements that I love in a spy story. The central thematic concept of truth and reality being distorted online is a genuinely terrific foundation for an espionage thriller. The focus on AI is the kind of huge swing I want from these movies, even if I was a bit, skeptical at first. It's high concept and topical, and its presence in the story imbues moments with a moody paranoia that is very much my shit. And Grace is a wonderful addition to the cast, so much so that I'm left wanting more, which I guess is a good thing for a part 1 to do, but the problem is, my desire doesn't stem from a place of intrigue, but rather confusion. And then there's the Ilsa of it all. I know most people aren't going to be as hung up on this as I am, but my God, when I say that moment almost derailed the film for me, hell, it did derail the film for me, I genuinely mean it. I felt myself disconnect from everything that was going on. It killed me. It irked me to no end, and I don't know what more I could say about that decision. It's just pathetic. Part of me is holding out hope that once part 2 is out, I will be able to watch these as one film and love them, but the other part of me knows that there are certain deficiencies here that can't be remedied by simply tacking on an ending that should have been there all along.